Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. Recently, I have encountered some comments on social media regarding the approval and command of Yahweh for child sacrifice within the Old Testament. Of course, some debate does exist on the subject. However, a majority of scholars do not argue in favor of Yahweh demanding any sort of child sacrifice. In this episode, therefore, we are going to look at Ezekiel 20 verses 25 and 26 and respond to comments that God commanded child sacrifice and its relationship with Exodus chapter 13 verse 1, chapter 22 verse 29, and Leviticus 20 verse 4. I should also like to note, though, that I'm not going to delve into the different types of child sacrifice because a topic that vast goes far beyond the scope of this video. Instead, we are only going to respond to comments from social media, more specifically, Dr. McClellan's comments on the present topic. So if you guys like this sort of content, please don't hesitate to hit the like button and make sure you guys are subscribed in order to receive future notifications on any upcoming videos, and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you should like to support this channel financially, the link will also be included in the description below. And finally, as always, I will list my sources in the description below. So, without further ado, let's delve into this week's topic. So, a few weeks ago, Dr. McClellan stated on social media that a passage here in question, namely Ezekiel 20 verses 25 and 26, informs us that God does indeed command child sacrifice. In an effort to support this claim, McClellan props up Ezekiel 20 verses 25 and 26 using Exodus 22 verse 29, stating, Exodus 22 verse 29 is a commandment to offer firstborn children as sacrifices. McClellan goes on to say that even Ezekiel 20 verses 25 and 26 acknowledges this. Later layers of the Exodus legislation, like chapters 13 and 34, had to renegotiate what that commandment was. Now, I will admit that I did not give McClellan time to flesh out his defense or claim more thoroughly, and we must remember that these comments were made on social media rather than in an academic setting like an academic journal. Ergo, we should probably take these comments then with a grain of salt. But is this really what the text means here, though, in both Ezekiel 20 in connection with Exodus 22, that God truly commands or desires child sacrifice? So, if God is not actually commanding child sacrifice in both Ezekiel 20 verses 25 and 26 and Exodus 22 verse 29, what is going on in these verses? Well, in order to fully or better understand what is going on in Ezekiel 20, a greater understanding of the historical context is needed, and context within the book. The prophet Ezekiel lived during the late 7th and 6th centuries BCE, that is, during the waning moments of the kingdom of Judah leading up to the exile. The reigns of the last few kings of Judah really established not only the atmosphere, but also the behavior of Judeans or Israelites, and the reasons why the Judeans or Israelites were exiled. Each of the final kings of Judah, from Manasseh to Zedekiah, apart from Josiah, was not good. And the final 4 kings were marred in revolt and rebellion even against Babylon, let alone God. Additionally, the existence of pagan altars certainly provoked the wrath and anger of God in the form of the Neo-Babylonian Empire at the beginning of the 6th century. Moreover, the practice of child sacrifice also led God to exile the Judeans or Israelites. Dr. Dewrell argues that archaeological, iconographic, and finally epigraphic evidence of child sacrifice exists. However, whether these sacrifices were to Yahweh or part of a syncretistic foreign cult apostasy in the form of the Israelites offering up their children to foreign gods is debatable. At any rate, all of these events lead up to the judgment spelt out for the reader from the 4th chapter to the 24th chapter of Ezekiel. And these are nothing more than judgments pronounced on Judah and Jerusalem. Indeed, Dr. Chisholm states that this is a direct judgment in which God is simply punishing the Israelites for their child sacrifice by causing the sinner to sin even more. Chisholm avers that his sovereign hardening of Pharaoh's heart in Exodus caused the stubborn king to disobey the divine command to release Israel from bondage. In other words, God uses their sin so that they sin more. All of this finally brings us to the 20th chapter of Ezekiel. Dr. Daniel Block avers that chapter 20 is an arraignment of the house of Israel, and to make known their abominations leads one to expect a riv, oracle, meaning then that it was a dispute to be adjudicated by judges and or priests. Dr. Leslie Allen corroborates Block here, stating that a related development is an element in the so-called covenant lawsuit, which recalls both Yahweh's benefits in past history and Israel's ingratitude. The meaning of the word itself, riv, means lawsuit or legal process according to the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, and lawsuit and legal process according to the Hallett. We see this with Absalom, who adjudicates cases for King David, who come before him, that is Absalom, in 2 Samuel 15. This is supported by the twofold occurrence of the word laken, which is simply the biblical Hebrew word for therefore, which often signals the transition between the indictment and the announcement of the punishment in judgment, oracle functioning as a speech of disputation. Interestingly, here is the addition of the rhetorical strategy reflected throughout the chapter, which is indicative of Ezekiel, namely that of parody. Block also states that with painstaking precision, incontrovertible logic, and deliberate skewing and distorting of the sacred traditions, Ezekiel turns the history of his people on its head, employing ancient theological and historical motifs, but infusing them with radically new content. He calls his audience to critical self-evaluation. Far from being a story of election and salvation, Israel's story is one of apostasy. If we home in on verses 25 and 26, Allen notes verse 25 echoes the laws of redemption of the firstborn, particularly represented in Exodus 13, verses 12 and 13. It ruled that whereas firstborn male sacrificial animals were to be sacrificed, firstborn sons were to be redeemed with money paid to the sanctuary. The combination of the motifs of giving and making over, verses 26 and 31, reminds the alert reader of chapter 16, verse 20 and verse 21, if you cross-reference or cross-referencing Leviticus 18:21, where they were used in a description of child sacrifice. There seems then to be a double entendre in that the verb b'cha'avir suggests the fuller phrase ba'esh va'esh b'cha'avir, which means to make over fire or surrender to the flames, which actually occurs in verse 31 of Ezekiel 20. It is a formula for a pagan rite widely practiced in the 7th century Judah. Accordingly, verse 25 seems to represent Ezekiel's retort to popular claims that in the law of the firstborn, Yahweh had authorized the child sacrifice offered in the syncretistic cult. In a Baroque twist worthy of the prophet, Ezekiel turns the theological tables on the practitioners. Very well, Yahweh did give the law they were citing, but it was given so that the obedience would not bring life, but would bring devastation. This is seemingly a reference to the cult of Molech, in which children were unfortunately sacrificed to the god. Now, I know there is some debate about whether Moloch was an actual god or does the term Molech just refer to a type of sacrifice? But again, I'm not going to delve into that topic of debate here. So, according to the law, in Exodus 22, verse 29, the text states, "The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me." Now, prima facie, the text seems to suggest that God does demand firstborn children to be sacrificed. However, a deeper look into the text suggests otherwise. Dr. John Durham contends that Israel must demonstrate an appropriate acknowledgement of the gifts of Yahweh that make their gifts possible. Firstborn sons were dedicated in Israel to Yahweh both actually and vicariously, but in service, not sacrifice. And Dr. Joel Baden of Yale Divinity School supports Durham, reasoning that there is not a single hint anywhere in the Bible or anywhere else in ancient Near East that such a practice was ever even remotely considered. So, we do not have to spend almost any energy on whether this was a real demand for child sacrifice. But what is it then? I think I'm willing to hear better alternatives, that what is going on here is consistent across wine, humans, and animals, and that what all three require is to be dedicated to the sanctuary. What happens to them then depends on what they are. Other biblical laws assume that the firstborn animals will be sacrificed on the altar immediately. One could presume that the wine would be poured out as a libation. Humans dedicated to the sanctuary do not get sacrificed or poured out. They serve like Samuel. Israelites who serve the sanctuary are called Levites. Not to get into the weeds, but Levite was a professional name, not a tribal one. And elsewhere we see the idea that the Levites serve in place of the dedicated firstborn. I think there is a common underlying idea there. It was once the case that the firstborn son went into the temple service, business, or was supposed to. That is a reasonable demand from God. Keep my sanctuaries always staffed. The basic principle then is that the firstborn of everything should go to God. The mistake is to assume that go to God means the same thing regardless of what is given. But that is just silly. They weren't willy-nilly sacrificing everything that crossed the temple threshold. Firstborn sons were theoretically to go into the sanctuary service business. Did they always, though? Probably not. At least none of the ones in our narratives do. But then again, none of the ones in our narrative gets sacrificed either. So I do want to apologize for the informality. That is, this is another social media post put forth by Baden, Dr. Baden, as it is not customary usually in my videos. However, his response here is rather telling. Dr. Baden is emphatically clear that Exodus 22 verse 29 is not a commandment to sacrifice firstborn children, but rather a commandment to dedicate their firstborn children to the sanctuary, namely God. Furthermore, the language expressed in this text is not indicative of child sacrifice. Words such as pass through the fire, slaughter, and present offerings seemingly suggest ritual offering, as in Ezekiel 16 verse 21. However, here in Exodus 22 verse 29, these words are notably absent, which lends credence to the notion that child sacrifice is not demanded here. Leviticus 20 verse 4 is rather explicit in its condemnation against child sacrifice, stating that an individual should be put to death when someone gives one of their children to Molech. Moreover, Exodus 13 verse 1 is also explicit, stating that firstborn sons should be consecrated to the Lord. The word there is kadesh, which simply means to make holy, which seems to counter the notion that God would demand child sacrifice in the book of Ezekiel. In conclusion, although we have evidence of child sacrifice in the Levant, the practice was certainly exposed as an egregious sin in Ezekiel 20, with the writer stating that if that is how the practitioners interpreted the law, then God did write that in the law so that God could bring about devastation. Furthermore, the law, whilst informing Israel to consecrate and dedicate their children to the sanctuary, also condemned the practice of child sacrifice, sentencing the person who does it to death, as well as punishment for those who do not put that person to death. Well, guys, that will conclude this topic on child sacrifice within the Old Testament. If you guys, again, like this video, please hit that like button, and make sure you guys are subscribed in order to receive future notifications on any upcoming videos. And if you guys, again, would like to support the channel financially, I will leave a link in the description below to my Patreon. Anyway, guys, I'll talk to you guys next time.